Ellie Mae Carson fled through a Wyoming blizzard, clutching her baby, while powerful rancher Garrett Barrows swore the child was his to claim. Barrows had money, men, and the kind of influence that could bend the law to his will, making his pursuit all the more ruthless. But fate placed them in the path of Tom Hargrove, a trapper whose aim and resolve were as unshakable as the mountains around him. And just wait until you hear the final heart-pounding turn that ensured justice had the last word. The northern Wyoming plateau looked iron-hard in January, the kind of country that made a person count each breath like coin. Snow lay in stubborn sheets over the knuckled hills and sifted into every seam of the old cabins, sealing shutters, loading beams, turning wood into a slow ache. Wind kept its long patrol across the open, dragging pale dust from creek beds, making cottonwoods whisper and the air taste faintly of tin. Tom Hargrove moved along on battered skis, scarf rough against his jaw, beard salted white. He traveled with the quiet thrift of a man who had learned to spend nothing, no motion, no warmth, no word he could not earn back. The traps hung empty in his pack, iron kissing iron with a dull clink at each push of his poles. He wasn't angry about the empty run. Winter took what it wanted and returned what it pleased. His job was to keep going, to read the country, to move through it without asking favors. Past a bend, the land dropped into a shallow draw, drifted over and stitched by the wind into dimples and crusted fans. Tom's eye hooks on small things. He trusted that habit more than he trusted luck, and it caught on a crooked shape tucked at the base of a snow dune. Out here the wind abandoned strange relics, a tarp corner, a thrown blanket, a plank shouldered off a sled. At first he marked it as one more of those and kept pace, but the shape refused to be simple. It held a stillness that didn't belong to wood or cloth, a hush that leaned outward and made a space in the day's noise. He checked the slope above for cornice break, listened to the rattle the wind makes when it drags granules over crust, then stepped off the hard track. The first step took him to the knee, the second to mid-thigh. The snow was soft where it looked firm, and his breath came like smoke in the pale light. He reached the shape and did not call out. He crouched. It was a woman. She lay on her side, curled small against the weather, coat pulled tight, hair lacquered with fine frost. Her face held the pale, careful stillness of porcelain once warmed and left to cool. Her lashes had frozen into tiny, glittering fans. Tom's stomach went tight, the way a ridge goes hollow underfoot. He spoke anyway, a name he did not know because a voice can be a rope. With the back of his glove, he brushed powder from her sleeve and saw where a seam had been mended in neat little X's, thread darker than the cloth. That detail, domestic and stubborn, said as much as any letter. He eased a hand to the edge of her coat. The fabric was stiff, but it gave, and the truth of the shape under it struck him in the same instant he saw it. A child lay there, swaddled in a faded blanket ladder-stitched along one side. The small mouth had a bluish cast, like creek ice before it clears, and trembled with a stubborn will to continue. The sound that came wasn't a full cry, more a thin protest against the size of the world. Something in Tom answered before he gave it permission. He remembered a cabin from years back, and a season when another set of footsteps had crossed his floor, the kind of memory a man keeps in a tin at the back of a shelf, and only opens when the weather inside him matches the weather outside. He knew, with a trapper's plain knowledge, that warmth can be borrowed and paid back with interest. He pressed two knuckles gently to the child's cheek. The skin was cold, but not slack, and the tiny breath counted time against his glove. The woman's eyelids fluttered at the touch of his shadow. She opened them, and despite the cold, there was a small banked fire there, a will set like a stake. Her voice came rough and shallow, as if pushed through paper. Please, save her. It wasn't a plea for herself. It was a handover of duty, simple as a tool passed across a workbench. Winter did not reward questions, and Tom had never been greedy for words. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath the child, lifted them both, and felt the cold try to take what he carried, quick and cunning as a thief. The way back would be slower. The draw offered a crooked path that half sheltered them, then rose toward the notch where the ridge broke like a tooth. Tom set his poles deep and let the baskets bite. The woman's breath tapped at his coat in uneven stitches. The child's determined warmth pressed into him, keeping truer time than any watch. He counted rhythm instead of distance. 10 strokes, breathe, 10 strokes, listen. and let the numbers keep fear from speaking in full sentences. Now and then he talked, not to fill the air, but to give it shape. He told the child about the stove's quiet song and the iron kettle, about a wool blanket that remembered cedar, about a spoon worn satin smooth by years of stirring stew. He told the woman, too, of ordinary mercies, boots thawing by the door, mittens that stood upright until they softened, the window's square of light at noon. He kept his words simple and present, as if facts could be stacked like bricks against the wind's persistence. The ridge asked its price. Fire woke in his legs. He set the woman down once to kick a step into the slope, then gathered her again, found his stance, and shouldered the last pitch. The world narrowed to breath and imagined wood smoke and the fierce insistence of the bundle against his ribs. At the top, the cabin showed itself, ordinary and square, dear in a way he left unnamed. The stovepipe wore a collar of rime. The door would be stubborn. He welcomed the thought. Stubborn doors hold back night. He lowered his shoulder, readying the latch, and the wind fell for a heartbeat, as if the country itself were listening to whether he would keep what he had taken up. He would. Tom's cabin stood apart from everything. A square of weather-darkened logs crouched against a stand of pine, the roof pitched steep to shed the weight of long winters. It was 5 miles to the nearest wagon road, and in January those miles might as well have been 50. He shouldered the door open, and the familiar scent of smoke and pine pitch moved around him like a welcome. The hearth was cold, its stones dark, but the iron stove waited patient in the corner. He lowered the woman gently onto his bunk, where elk hides were folded thick against the draft from the chink lines, then crossed to the stove. Birch curls caught quick, the flames licking through in a restless climb. He fed them splits of pine and then heavier cuts of aspen until the door glass glowed. The sound of the fire settled into a steady, convincing hum. From the shelf above, he took a clay mug, filled it with water from the barrel, set it on the stove, and stirred in honey until the amber swirl ran clear. Returning to the bunk, he helped her drink in small swallows, one hand steadying the cup, the other bracing her shoulder. She was light in the way that speaks of too many days without shelter. Her eyes were half closed, but followed his movements, measuring him without alarm. The child made a small mewling sound from where he'd laid her in the crook of his arm. Tom knew from a lesson learned years ago in a Montana line shack with a blizzard scratching at the shutters that a man's own warmth was worth more than any blanket when the cold had sunk deep. He loosened his coat, pressed the bundle against his chest, and let his own breath do the work of bringing the little one back toward comfort. Each sigh from her seemed to stitch a thread back into the fabric of life. The woman's breathing slowed, no longer the ragged catch it had been on the trail. After a time she spoke, her voice a thin thread that frayed with each word. Ellie Mae Carson. The name hung between them as if it needed room to stand. She spoke again, in bits and pieces, and Tom had to piece them together, like scattered trapline markers. She had been running. There were people behind her, men with the right kind of horses for long chases, the wrong kind of eyes for mercy. They wanted the child, not because she was helpless, but because of who she was. The father, a man named Garrett Barrows, owned more acres than a man could ride in 2 days. In his telling, Ellie was a runaway, and the girl she carried was his rightful heir, the little legacy he meant to claim. Tom heard the words and weighed them the way a hunter weighs tracks in fresh snow, looking for the truth in the shape, not in the story. He saw the fear in Ellie's eyes, but it was braced by something harder than fear, something that had been tempered in nights of keeping watch and mornings of moving before the frost had a chance to bite. She did not speak of herself as if she mattered. Every sentence bent toward the child's safety, as if her own breath was only another way to keep the girl alive. The stove ticked as it settled into its heat. Outside, the wind combed the pines, but in here the air grew warm enough that the frost on Ellie's hair melted and ran in small silver lines down her temples. Tom pulled another hide over her, careful not to jostle the sleeping infant now tucked between them on the bunk. He had lived years without company, his days measured by the work of traps, the small trades at the post, the silence of the ridge. He thought himself content in that narrow ledger. But now, watching Ellie's eyelids lower in something like trust, he felt an older pull, one that spoke of duty not born from bargain or law, but from the plain fact that some things, once brought into your keeping, could not be let go. It was not rescue in the way a man brags about later. It was something quieter and heavier, a charge taken on without ceremony. For the first time in years, Tom knew he would fight for more than his own survival. On the third morning, the wind laid itself down, leaving the land under a sky pale as tin. The snow still stood high around the cabin, crusted on top, whispering under its own weight. Tom was setting another log on the stove when he caught it, a distant, deliberate sound beneath the hush. Hooves. Heavy ones, working through deep drifts. Then came the faint, uneven rasp of runners over ice. He crossed to the narrow window and pushed aside the hide curtain. Out on the trail from the east, 4 riders emerged from the folds of the hills, their mounts sending plumes of frost with each breath. A long sleigh followed behind them, the runners squealing when they hit bare spots. At the front rode a man Tom knew by sight, though they'd never traded words, Garrett Barrows. The rancher sat tall in the saddle, shoulders squared under a coat trimmed with wolf fur, a rifle angled easy in one gloved hand. His eyes, narrowed against the light, searched the cabin with the slow precision of a hawk measuring a clearing for movement. The other men flanked him in a loose diamond, each armed, their faces set in that practiced blankness that hides intent but not loyalty. Barrows swung down from his horse, the crunch of his boots clear even at this distance. He let the reins drop, his stride purposeful across the trampled snow. "Hargrove." His voice carried like a crack in the ice, sharp and unbothered by the cold. "You're holding a thief in there. Hand her over and I'll forget I saw you." Tom stepped out onto the porch, the old crow resting in the crook of his arm, muzzle just low enough to show it wasn't an accident he held it. The boards under his boots groaned, the sound small but steady in the white silence. "There's no thief here," he said evenly. "Only a mother and her child." "And you mean to take one from the other?" Barrow's expression barely shifted, but something in his gaze hardened. "She's no mother," he replied, voice gone cold as the crusted drifts around them. "She was put into my service. Nothing more. That child is mine, my blood, and she's coming with me." The words fell with the weight of someone used to getting what he claimed. Tom knew the shape of Barrow's reach in this part of the territory. Land enough to make maps bow, cattle herds that could darken a valley, and friends in offices who turned trouble into opportunity. Ellie had none of that. Only the truth she carried and the small life wrapped in her arms. Truth, Tom thought, was worth more than gold in the telling, but in these hills, gold usually spoke first. Barrows closed some of the distance, his boots cutting a new line in the snow. The other riders didn't move, but their hands were loose on their reins, ready. Tom felt the slow coil of the moment drawing tight, the part where choice turns to fact. He shifted his stance, bringing the crag up, the sight catching a point of light. His voice, when it came, was quieter than Barrows, but carried further. "You take one more step," he said, "and you won't take another." The space between them held still. The wind stayed down. The sound of the stove inside ticked faintly in the pause. Out here, law was measured in yards and heartbeats, and Tom was prepared to spend both. The standoff didn't break in gunfire. Barrows stood there long enough for the air between them to turn brittle, then let a slow, deliberate smile crease his face. It wasn't the smile of a man backing down, it was the mark of someone changing the angle of his reach. "You've bought yourself a little time, Hargrove," he said, brushing a clump of snow from his coat. "But I'll be back, with men and the law riding beside me." He mounted in one smooth motion, the leather creaking under his weight, and with a curt nod to his riders, turned his horse back toward the east. The sleigh runners shrieked briefly against a bare patch, then the whole party was swallowed by the white distance. Tom stayed on the porch until they were gone from sight. Inside, the cabin seemed smaller, the air heavier. Ellie sat by the stove, the child pressed close, but the tremor in her shoulders wasn't from the cold. She had heard every word, understood what it meant. Their days here were counted, and the count was short. As the light faded and the cabin walls drew in, Tom made his choice. Waiting for Barrows to return was like sitting under an avalanche cornice and hoping the wind would spare you. That night, with the moon a thin hook over the ridge, he packed for the trail. He pulled the old sled from its lean-to, brushed the snow from its runners, and hitched his 2 best dogs, Bear and Flint. The air had the kind of stillness that often breaks into a hard wind before dawn. Ellie bundled the girl in layers of wool, her hands moving with the care of someone handling what is most fragile. They left without lanterns, the snow's faint glow enough to mark the track. The climb toward the pass was slow and grinding. Snowflakes, fine as sifted flour, began to fall, blown sideways into their eyes. The wind found its teeth again, pushing against them, but Tom kept the team steady, stopping only to check on Ellie and the child. By the time the mission's steeple showed through the haze, a dark arrow in the white, Ellie was leaning more on Tom's arm than she was walking. Inside the station, the smell of pine soap and hearth fire met them. The priest, an older man with a gaze as steady as winter light, took one look and began barking orders to the small knot of helpers. They lifted Ellie toward a cot, but her breath came fast and shallow, and her eyes sought Tom. Her voice was scarcely more than the brush of wind on snow. "Thank you. You saved her." The words cost her effort, but they carried a peace that no shelter could give. Her fingers, cold but still gentle, brushed the child's cheek once, then stilled. Tom stood there, the infant in his arms, the murmur of the room fading into the long, quiet note of loss. At the threshold, with the last light of day laying gold over the mountains, he stepped outside. The sky was wide and empty, the peaks like frozen waves. He looked down at the girl, small, warm, alive, and something in him settled into place. He spoke his vow not for others to hear, but for the mountains, which kept such promises well. He would raise her as his own, guard her from the greed that had taken her mother, and teach her the worth of truth in a land where gold too often spoke louder. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine from the valley, and Tom knew the measure of the price paid. A life for a life, and the law he now carried was not the one written in books, but the one etched in the silence of the high country. Some things once given to your care must be protected at any cost.